The United States owes over $34 trillion. That number is so large and it's almost impossible to understand. But here's the strange part. Most people have no idea who that money is actually owed to. But before we can answer that, we need to understand how the debt happens in the first place. Every year, the government spends money on things like the military, infrastructure, healthcare, and social programs. Normally, that money is supposed to come from taxes. But here's the problem. Most years, the government actually spends more money than it collects. That gap is called a deficit. And when that happens, the government needs to find the missing money somewhere else. So instead of raising taxes overnight, the government does something much easier. It borrows the money. And it does that by selling something called treasury bonds. A treasury bond is basically an IOU. Investors give the government money today, and the government promises to pay it back later with interest, which means that every time the government runs a deficit, it isn't just spending money, it's adding new debt to the total. So now the obvious question is, who is actually giving the government all this money? Who are they borrowing from? Because it's not just one person, and it's not just one country, it's millions of different lenders. First, a huge portion of the debt is owned by ordinary people. Not directly, but through things like pensions, savings funds, and retirement accounts. So if you've ever paid into a pension, you might already be lending money to the government without even realizing it. Then you've got banks and financial institutions. They buy massive amounts of government debt. Why? Because treasury bonds are seen as one of the safest investments in the world. The government is expected to always pay its debts. So for banks, it's predictable, steady profit. But here's where it gets more interesting. Foreign countries also own a big slice. Countries like China and Japan hold hundreds of billions in US debt, which sounds insane. And why would another country fund your spending? Because it benefits them too. By buying US debt, they keep their own economies stable and keep money flowing through global trade. And then there's one more major player, one that most people completely overlook. The government owes money to itself through things like Social Security and public funds. So when you hear trillions in debt, it's not owed to one place. It's spread across people, banks, countries, and even the government itself. So now you understand who owns the debt. But here's the part most people never think about. Why does it just keep growing? Why doesn't the government just pay it off? Because in reality, it's not designed to go away. Every single year, the government spends more money than it brings in through taxes. That gap is the deficit. And to fill that gap, they borrow more money, which means every year, new debt is added on top of the old debt. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Even if the government stopped spending extra money tomorrow, the debt still wouldn't stop growing. Why? Because of interest. Remember those treasury bonds? The government doesn't just pay back what it borrowed. It also has to pay extra to everyone who lent them money. That's the cost of borrowing. So now think about this. To pay off old debt and interest, the government often has to borrow even more money, which creates new debt that also has interest. And this is where the cycle begins. Borrow money, pay interest, then borrow more to cover it, over and over again. So the system isn't just growing by accident, it's growing by design. Because as long as governments run deficits, and as long as interest exists, the total debt keeps increasing. So now step back for a second. Because this isn't just some abstract number on a screen. This is a system where debt feeds on itself, where money is constantly being borrowed, and just to keep the system running. And the more it grows, the harder it becomes to ever stop, which means something most people never realize. Paying off the national debt isn't just difficult, it would require completely changing how the entire system works. So the question isn't really, why don't they just pay it off? It's this, what happens if they can't keep it going anymore?